The rain had been relentless for days. Thick, heavy drops pounded against the roofs of small, humble homes, turning dirt paths into muddy rivers and streams into raging torrents. The villagers were used to storms. This was their home, after all. But even the oldest among them couldn't remember a storm like this. It felt like the skies had opened up in anger, pouring out all their fury onto the world below. In the midst of it all was a dog. Not just any dog, though. This was the kind of loyal companion that seemed to understand the language of the heart, the kind that didn't need words to know when something was wrong. His fur was soaked through, and his paws were caked with mud as he paced outside the home of a young family. He seemed restless, his ears twitching and nose raised toward the stormy sky, as if sensing something no one else could. Inside the modest house, a baby slept peacefully in a crib, blissfully unaware of the chaos outside. The parents, though weary from the constant sound of rain, had finally allowed themselves a moment to rest. They didn't know that the river nearby, usually so calm and unthreatening, had begun to swell beyond its banks. The current was rising fast, swallowing everything in its path, and the village was directly in its way. Suddenly, the dog barked. It wasn't a casual bark or a playful one. It was sharp, urgent, and insistent. He clawed at the door, barking louder and louder, his whole body trembling with a sense of purpose. But the sound of the storm drowned him out, and the family remained oblivious. The water was coming faster now, seeping into the edges of the village, carrying with it debris and destruction. The dog could feel it, sense it, smell it in the air. Without hesitation, he sprang into action. He leaped through the broken fence and darted toward the rising water, his instincts leading him to the source of danger. But this was no ordinary dog. He wasn't just running for his own safety. He had a mission, and that mission was the baby, the tiny human he had watched over since the day she was born. She was his responsibility, his family, and he would stop at nothing to protect her. As the floodwaters crept closer, the dog returned to the house, barking with even more urgency. This time, the father stirred, his eyes snapping open. Something about the dog's cries sent a chill down his spine. He grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, only to be met with a scene that made his heart drop. The water was already at the edge of their property, and it was rising fast. "Wake up. We need to leave now," he shouted, shaking his wife awake. Panic set in as they realized how little time they had. The mother rushed to the crib, scooping up the baby while the father grabbed a few essentials. But as they struggled to find a way out, the water surged into their home, blocking the main door. It was chaos. The parents were frantic, the baby cried, and the storm showed no signs of mercy. But through it all, the dog remained calm, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if formulating a plan. Then, without warning, he took off again, disappearing into the storm. What happened next would leave the entire village speechless. The dog vanished into the darkness, his silhouette quickly swallowed by the curtain of rain. The parents, clutching their baby tightly, stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Fear gripped them as the icy water surged around their ankles, rising steadily with each passing second. The father's mind raced. Every path he could think of was already blocked, and the storm seemed to mock their every move. "We can't stay here," he yelled over the roaring of the rain. His wife nodded, holding the baby close to her chest. She could feel the child's tiny body trembling, not from the cold but from the sheer confusion of the chaos unfolding around them. The mother's voice trembled as she asked, "Where did he go? Why did he run off like that?" The father didn't have an answer. He wanted to believe the dog was just scared and acting on instinct, but deep down, he knew better. That dog wasn't ordinary. He never had been. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he always seemed to know when danger was near, that made him different. The dog hadn't run off in fear. He had run with a purpose. As the parents waded through the water, the current growing stronger with each step. The storm continued to rage. The sound of the wind howling through the trees was almost deafening, and the relentless rain made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. They clung to each other, desperate to find higher ground, but every path seemed to lead them deeper into the flood. Meanwhile, the dog was already ahead, his powerful legs propelling him through the rising water. His nose twitched, his ears perked, and his eyes darted through the darkness. He wasn't just running blindly. He was following a scent, a trail that only he could detect. The dog's determination was unshakable. He had no time for fear, no time for hesitation. He knew what needed to be done, and he wasn't going to stop until he succeeded. The storm showed no mercy. Trees snapped under the pressure of the wind, their broken limbs carried away by the flood. Villagers screamed in the distance, their voices carried by the wind, but quickly drowned out by the storm's fury. It was a scene of pure chaos, the kind that left no time to think, only to act. The dog reached the edge of the village, where the water was deepest and the current strongest. He paused for a moment, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Then, without hesitation, he dove into the torrent. His powerful strokes cut through the water, and his head bobbed above the surface as he swam toward the far end of the village. Back at the house, the parents were struggling. The water had risen to their waists, and the current threatened to sweep them off their feet. The father held tightly to his wife's arm, using every ounce of strength he had to keep them moving forward. The baby's cries had softened to whimpers, her tiny face buried against her mother's shoulder. "Look," the mother shouted, pointing toward the faint glow of a lantern in the distance. It was the home of an elderly neighbor, perched slightly higher on the hill. The sight gave them a glimmer of hope, and they pushed forward with renewed determination. But with every step they took, the water seemed to push back harder, as if trying to drag them under. At that very moment, the dog reached his destination. It was an old barn at the far edge of the village, half submerged in water but still standing. Inside, a group of animals huddled together: cows, goats, and a few chickens, all terrified and trapped. The dog barked sharply, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm. The animals stirred, their eyes wide with fear, but they didn't move. The dog barked again, more urgently this time, and began to circle the animals, nudging them toward the barn's exit. It was as if he understood that their survival depended on getting them to safety. Slowly, hesitantly, the animals began to move, their instincts telling them to trust the dog. As the animals filed out of the barn, the dog led them toward a narrow path that wound up the hill, away from the flood. It was the same path he had used countless times before while roaming the village, and he knew it well. The water was still rising, but the path offered a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless, for the animals to escape. Back in the heart of the village, the parents finally reached the neighbor's house. The old man stood in the doorway, his lantern casting a warm glow that cut through the darkness. He waved them inside, his weathered face etched with concern. "Thank God you made it," he said, his voice heavy with relief. "The river's worse than I've ever seen. You'll be safe here, for now." The mother collapsed into a chair, clutching her baby tightly as tears streamed down her face. The father looked out the window, his eyes scanning the floodwaters for any sign of the dog. "Have you seen him?" he asked the old man. "Our dog. He ran off earlier. He saved us, I think, but now he's gone." The old man shook his head. "No, I haven't seen him. But if he's out there, well, he's braver than most men I know." The father nodded, his jaw tightening as he tried to hold back his emotions. The dog had been more than just a pet to them. He was family. And now, as the storm continued to rage, they couldn't help but fear the worst. Hours passed, but the storm showed no signs of letting up. The floodwaters continued to rise, swallowing homes and fields alike. The village was unrecognizable, a chaotic mess of water and debris. Just as dawn began to break, casting a faint light over the destruction, a sound broke through the storm. It was faint at first, But it grew louder, more distinct, a bark. The father bolted to the door, his heart pounding as he scanned the horizon. And then he saw him. The dog was coming up the hill, his fur matted and his body trembling with exhaustion. Behind him, a line of animals followed, their hooves splashing through the water as they climbed toward safety. The father's eyes widened in disbelief. "He did it," he whispered. "He brought them all." The dog reached the top of the hill and collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The animals gathered around him, as if understanding that they owed their lives to this unlikely hero. But the story wasn't over. The dog lifted his head, his eyes meeting the father's, and barked again, softly this time, but with a sense of urgency. It was as if he was trying to say something, to warn them that the danger wasn't over yet. The father knelt beside him, running his hand gently over the dog's wet fur. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to tell us?" The dog barked again and struggled to his feet, his body trembling but his spirit unbroken. He turned toward the village, his ears pricked and his tail stiff. The father's stomach dropped. Whatever the dog had sensed wasn't over. The flood may have been the beginning, but something else was coming. Something even the dog couldn't face alone. The dog didn't wait for the father to understand. He took off again, his legs still shaky but driven by an unrelenting determination. His bark echoed through the storm as he disappeared back toward the village. The father stood frozen for a moment, torn between following him and staying with his family. But the dog's actions had always been purposeful, and something deep in his heart told him to trust him. The mother's voice broke through his hesitation. "What's he doing? He can't go back there. He'll get swept away." The father grabbed the old man's lantern and turned to her, his voice firm but filled with uncertainty. "I need to follow him. He's trying to tell us something. I can feel it." Before she could protest, he was already out the door, wading back into the frigid water. The storm was still merciless, but the faint light of the rising sun gave him just enough visibility to navigate. Every step was a struggle, the current threatening to pull him under, but he pushed forward, his eyes fixed on the dog's fading figure in the distance. The dog seemed to move with a purpose, his nose low to the ground as if tracking something. He barked every few moments, a sound that cut through the chaos and guided the father forward. The farther they went, the more destruction became apparent. Homes were partially submerged, furniture and belongings floated aimlessly, and the once vibrant village was now a ghostly shell of what it had been. Suddenly, the dog stopped. He stood on the edge of a collapsed bridge, his ears perked and his body tense. The father finally caught up, panting and clutching his side. He shined the lantern ahead, trying to see what had captured the dog's attention. At first, there was nothing but water and debris, but then he heard it, a faint, desperate cry for help. His heart sank as he realized what the dog had been trying to tell them. Someone was still out there, trapped in the flood. The dog barked again, his body inching forward as if he was ready to jump in, but the father grabbed his collar. "No, boy, you've done enough. I'll get them." He scanned the water, his eyes darting between the swirling currents and the scattered wreckage. Then he saw it, a small wooden raft, barely holding together, with a young child clinging to it for dear life. The child's cries were weak, almost drowned out by the storm, but they pierced through the father's heart like a dagger. The father's first instinct was to dive in, but the current was too strong. He knew he wouldn't make it on his own. He looked around desperately, searching for anything that could help. That's when the dog barked again, pulling at his collar as if urging him to follow. The father hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Lead the way." The dog took off along the riverbank, his movements careful but swift. He led the father to a spot where a long wooden beam from the collapsed bridge had lodged itself against the bank. It stretched out over the water, close enough to the raft that it might work. The father didn't waste a second. He climbed onto the beam, gripping it tightly as it wobbled under his weight. The dog stayed behind, barking encouragement as if willing him to succeed. Step by step, the father edged closer to the child, his heart pounding with fear and determination. The raft was barely holding together, and the child's grip was slipping. "Hold on," the father shouted, his voice strained. "I'm coming." Just as he reached the end of the beam, the raft tilted dangerously, and the child let out a terrified scream. Without thinking, the father lunged forward, grabbing the child's arm just as the raft broke apart beneath them. The sudden movement sent a shockwave through the beam, and for a moment, it seemed like they would both be swallowed by the raging water. But somehow, he managed to pull the child onto the beam, holding them tightly as he inched his way back to solid ground. The dog was waiting for them, his tail wagging despite his exhaustion. The father collapsed onto the muddy bank, cradling the child in his arms. The little boy was soaked and shivering, but he was alive. The father looked at the dog, his voice breaking. You knew he was out here." The dog licked his face, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The father hugged him tightly, his gratitude beyond words. But the dog wasn't done yet. He pulled away, barking sharply and turning back toward the village. The father's stomach tightened. "There's more, isn't there?" he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. He handed the child to a nearby neighbor who had appeared on the hill and stood up, following the dog once more. The destruction grew worse as they ventured deeper into the heart of the village. The water was higher here, and the wreckage more severe. The dog led him to a cluster of homes that had been completely surrounded by water. The cries of trapped villagers could be heard faintly through the storm, their voices filled with panic and despair. The dog barked furiously, running back and forth along the water's edge, as if urging the father to do something. The father scanned the area, his mind racing. There were at least 3 families trapped, and no clear way to reach them. Then he saw it, a small fishing boat, half submerged but still usable. It was tied to a nearby tree, its rope barely holding against the current. The father waded into the water, his muscles straining as he fought against the pull of the flood. He untied the boat and dragged it to the nearest house, yelling for the people inside to climb in. One by one, they emerged, a mother clutching a baby, an elderly man leaning on a makeshift cane, and 2 young children holding each other tightly. The father helped them into the boat, his hands shaking from the cold and the effort. The dog didn't wait for instructions. He ran ahead to the next house, barking and scratching at the door to alert the family inside. The father followed with the boat, his body aching, but his spirit fueled by the dog's unwavering determination. House by house, they rescued as many people as they could, the boat growing heavier with each trip. The father's lungs burned, his legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but he kept going. The dog, despite his exhaustion, refused to stop, leading the way with an unrelenting drive. Finally, as the sky began to clear and the floodwaters started to recede, the last family was brought to safety. The father collapsed onto the muddy ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. The dog lay beside him, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he fought to catch his breath. The villagers gathered around them, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and awe. They had all seen it, the way the dog had led the rescues, his bravery and determination inspiring them to keep going. But as the father looked at the dog, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. The dog's eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, still held that same urgency, that same unspoken message. And then, in the distance, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. The father's heart sank as he realized what it was. The dam upstream, weakened by the relentless storm, was beginning to give way. The dog struggled to his feet, his ears pricked and his body tense. He barked once, a sound that seemed to echo across the valley, and took off toward the dam. The father's heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, his voice hoarse as he shouted after him, "No, come back. It's too dangerous." But the dog didn't stop. He ran with everything he had left, his body moving as if it was powered by sheer will alone. The father hesitated for a split second, torn between the safety of his family and the undeniable pull to follow the dog. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. The dog had already done so much, but it was clear he wasn't finished yet. With one final look at his family, he turned and ran after him, the sound of the dam's rumble growing louder with every step. The father sprinted after the dog, his feet slipping in the thick mud as the earth trembled beneath him. The rumble from the dam grew louder, each vibration sending a wave of dread through his chest. The sky had lightened, but the storm's remnants lingered, with cold rain still falling in a steady drizzle. He could barely see the dog ahead, his dark figure darting through the wreckage and debris left by the flood. As he followed, a terrifying thought gripped his mind. What if the dam gave way completely? The water it held back was immense, enough to drown not just the village, but everything for miles downstream. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to stop. That dog had saved his family and countless others tonight. Whatever he was trying to do now, the father had to see it through. When he finally reached the dam, the sight before him made his heart drop. Cracks ran along the massive concrete structure, water spurting through them like open wounds. The dam groaned under the pressure, large chunks of debris littering its base where parts had already crumbled. But what caught his eye most was the dog. There he was, perched on a narrow ledge near the dam's edge, barking furiously at something or someone. The father squinted, his breath catching as he saw a small figure clinging desperately to a piece of rebar sticking out of the crumbling wall. It was a boy, no older than 10, his arms shaking as he struggled to hold on against the rushing water. The father froze for a moment, the enormity of the situation hitting him like a tidal wave. How had the boy gotten here? Was he swept away earlier, unnoticed in the chaos of the storm? None of it mattered now. All that mattered was saving him before the dam collapsed completely. The dog barked again, louder this time, as if urging the father to act. The father nodded, his hands trembling as he searched for a way to reach the boy. The water below was ferocious, churning with debris that would easily drag anyone under. The ledge the dog stood on was slick and narrow, barely enough to support him, let alone a full-grown man. "Hold on," the father yelled to the boy, though his voice was nearly drowned out by the roaring water. "I'm coming to get you." The boy's head turned toward him, his face pale and streaked with mud. He didn't respond, but the terror in his wide eyes spoke volumes. The father scanned the area, his mind racing. Just then, he spotted a length of rope tangled in some nearby debris. He grabbed it, tying one end around his waist and securing the other to a sturdy tree trunk. It wasn't perfect, but it was all he had. The dog barked again, his body tense as he inched closer to the boy. The father's heart pounded as he made his way toward the ledge, the rope his only lifeline. The water sprayed up from below, soaking him to the bone, as the dam groaned ominously. Just as he reached the ledge, a deafening crack split the air. The father turned to see a massive section of the dam breaking away, tumbling into the water below with a thunderous crash. The entire structure shuddered, and the cracks spread further, widening with alarming speed. Time was running out. The boy's grip was failing. His fingers slipped slightly, and he let out a panicked cry. The father lunged forward, his arms outstretched as he grabbed hold of the boy's wrist. "I've got you," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Don't let go." The boy clung to him, his small body trembling violently. But just as the father began to pull him up, the ledge beneath them shifted. A chunk of rock crumbled away, sending the dog skidding dangerously close to the edge. "No," the father yelled, his free hand reaching out instinctively. The dog scrambled, his claws scraping against the slick surface as he fought to regain his footing. For a horrifying moment, it seemed like he wouldn't make it. But then, with one final push, he leaped back to safety, landing on a more stable part of the ledge. The father let out a shaky breath, his relief short-lived as the dam groaned again. The cracks were widening faster now, water gushing through with terrifying force. He pulled the boy closer, wrapping his arms tightly around him. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice urgent. The boy nodded weakly, his energy clearly spent. The father turned back toward the rope, but the sight stopped him cold. The tree it was tied to had been uprooted, its roots exposed as the ground beneath it gave way to the relentless water. The rope dangled uselessly, offering no way back. Panic surged through him. They were trapped. The only way off the ledge was through the water. But the current was too strong. It would sweep them away in seconds. And then he felt it. A tug on his sleeve. He looked down to see the dog. His eyes locked on his, as if trying to communicate something. The dog barked once, then turned and started down a narrow path that wound along the dam's edge. It was steep and treacherous, barely visible among the rubble. But it was a path. The father didn't hesitate. With the boy in his arms, he followed the dog, his steps careful but quick. The ground beneath them was unstable, every step a gamble as rocks shifted and slid. The boy buried his face in the father's chest, his small hands clutching tightly to his shirt. The dog led the way, his movements precise despite the chaos around him. He stopped occasionally to bark, urging them to keep moving. The father's legs burned with the effort, but he didn't dare slow down. As they climbed higher, the view of the dam grew more ominous. Entire sections were collapsing now, sending massive waves crashing into the valley below. The water was rising rapidly, swallowing everything in its path. Just when it seemed like there was no escape, the dog stopped. He stood at the entrance to a small cave, hidden behind a cluster of rocks. The father hesitated for a moment, unsure if it would offer any real protection. But the dog barked sharply, his eyes leaving no room for doubt. The father ducked inside, the boy still clutched tightly in his arms. The cave was shallow but sturdy, its walls made of solid rock. The dog followed them in, his body pressed close to the father's legs as if seeking reassurance. The father collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The boy clung to him, his small body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Outside, the dam let out one final deafening crack. And then it happened. The roar of the collapsing dam echoed through the valley like a thunderclap. The ground shook violently as the last remnants of the structure gave way, unleashing a torrent of water so massive it swallowed everything in its path. The father held the boy tightly, shielding him with his body as the cave trembled under the force of the flood. Rocks dislodged from the entrance, tumbling down, and the sound of rushing water filled the air. For a moment, it felt as if the world itself was breaking apart. The dog stood at the cave's entrance, his body tense as he stared out at the chaos. The father called to him, his voice cracking. "Come here. Stay with us." But the dog didn't move. He stood firm, his ears perked and his gaze fixed on something in the distance. The father followed the dog's line of sight, his heart pounding. Through the heavy rain and swirling debris, he saw it, an old towering tree on the far side of the valley, its roots partially exposed, but still clinging to the earth. The floodwaters were surging toward it, but it stood defiant, a lone beacon in the destruction. And then the dog bolted. "No, stop," the father shouted, his voice filled with panic. He tried to lunge after him, but the boy's weight in his arms and the unstable ground held him back. He watched helplessly as the dog darted out of the cave and into the chaos, his small figure disappearing into the rain. The father's mind raced. Why had the dog run? Was he looking for something or someone? It didn't make sense. But deep down, the father knew this wasn't random. The dog had led them to safety time and time again. Whatever he was doing now, it had a purpose. Clutching the boy tightly, he turned his attention back to their immediate danger. The water was rising fast, creeping closer to the cave's entrance with every passing second. The roar was deafening, and the air was thick with the smell of mud and debris. The father's instincts screamed at him to stay put, to wait for the worst to pass. but his heart told him otherwise. The boy stirred in his arms, his voice barely audible. The dog. He's saving someone, isn't he? The father looked down at the boy, his chest tightening. I don't know, he admitted, his voice shaking. But we can't let his effort go to waste. We have to keep moving. With a deep breath, he adjusted his grip on the boy and stepped out of the cave. The ground was slippery and unstable, but he pushed forward, following the faint tracks the dog had left behind. The rain was relentless, stinging his face as he moved, but he kept going. As they climbed higher, the floodwaters surged below them, carrying away trees, debris, and remnants of the village. The father's legs ached, his lungs burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The boy clung to him tightly, his small arms wrapped around the father's neck. Finally, they'd reached the top of a ridge overlooking the valley. The father collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air as he set the boy down beside him. From here, they could see the full extent of the devastation. The village was gone, submerged under a churning sea of water. The dam was no more, and the floodwaters stretched as far as the eye could see. But then, something caught his eye. In the distance, near the old tree, he saw movement. Squinting through the rain, he spotted the dog. He was struggling against the current, pulling something, or someone, through the water. The father's heart leaped into his throat. He found someone, he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. The boy scrambled to his knees, his eyes wide. He's bringing them back. The father didn't hesitate. Despite his exhaustion, he got to his feet and started down the ridge, his legs shaking with effort. The boy followed close behind, his small steps determined. As they drew closer, the scene became clearer. The dog was dragging a person, a woman, through the water, her body limp and her face pale. The father's chest tightened as he realized the dog was struggling. The current was too strong, and the weight of the woman was pulling him under. "Hold on," the father shouted, his voice carrying over the roar of the flood. He waded into the water, his arms outstretched as he fought against the current. The dog saw him and barked, his movements frantic as he tried to push the woman toward him. With a final surge of effort, the father reached them. He grabbed the woman under her arms and pulled her onto the muddy bank, his muscles straining with the effort. The dog scrambled out of the water after them, collapsing onto the ground with a wheeze. The father turned the woman onto her back, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing. But then she coughed weakly, water spilling from her mouth as her chest heaved. "She's alive," the father shouted, his voice breaking with relief. E-boy dropped to his knees beside them, his small hands clutching the woman's arm. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. The father looked down at her, his brow furrowing as recognition dawned. She was one of the villagers, a woman who had gone missing earlier in the storm. But before he could say anything, the woman opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto the dog. You came back," she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with emotion. The father stared at her, confused. "You know this dog?" The woman nodded weakly, her eyes filling with tears. "He was mine, before I lost him. I thought he was gone forever. But he found me. He came back for me." The father looked at the dog, his chest tightening. The dog lay on the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes were bright. He let out a low, contented whine, his tail wagging faintly. And then, as the rain began to ease and the floodwaters started to recede, the father realized the truth. This dog wasn't just a hero. He was a guardian, a protector who had been watching over the village all along. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, the father knelt beside the dog, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved us, all of us. We owe you everything." The dog blinked slowly, his head resting on the ground as if finally allowing himself to rest. But just as the father thought the ordeal was over, a faint sound reached his ears. It was coming from the direction of the village. Voices calling out for help. The father's heart sank as he realized the truth. Not everyone had made it to safety. There were still people out there, trapped and waiting to be saved. He looked down at the dog, who had already lifted his head, his ears perking up despite his exhaustion. The father shook his head in disbelief, a small smile breaking through the tension. "You're not done yet, are you?" he said softly. The dog wagged his tail weakly, his determination shining through once more. The father stood, his body aching, but his resolve unshaken. "Then let's go." Together, with the boy and the woman following close behind, they turned back toward the village, ready to face whatever came next. The dog, once again leading the way, proved that true heroes never rest, not when there's still a chance to save one more life. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the rain finally eased into a faint drizzle. The world, still soaked and battered from the storm, seemed to hold its breath in the fragile calm. The father trudged through the mud with the boy and the woman by his side, their steps slow but purposeful. The dog led the way, his movements steady despite the exhaustion that showed in his every step. The voices grew louder as they approached the remnants of the village. What was once a place filled with life and laughter was now a scene of devastation. Houses had been swept away or reduced to piles of debris, and the streets were unrecognizable under layers of silt and broken wood. Yet through the destruction, there was movement, survivors who had managed to hold on, calling out for help and searching for loved ones. The father's heart clenched as he took in the sight. The flood had taken so much, but it hadn't taken everything. People were alive, clinging to hope, and that was enough to drive him forward. He tightened his grip on the boy's hand and quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the wreckage for anyone in need. The dog, as if sensing the urgency, bounded ahead, his tail wagging faintly despite his weariness. He stopped suddenly near a pile of rubble, barking sharply. The father rushed over, his breath catching as he heard a faint cry from beneath the debris. Without hesitation, he began pulling away the broken wood and stones, his hands raw and bleeding, but his determination unwavering. "Help me," he called to the others. Within moments, several villagers joined him, their faces pale but their movements resolute. Together, they worked to free the person trapped beneath the rubble. When they finally lifted the last piece, a young girl emerged, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She threw her arms around the father, sobbing into his chest. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You're safe now." The dog barked again, drawing their attention to another area. Again and again, he led them to survivors, his sharp instincts cutting through the chaos like a guiding light. The father marveled at the dog's resilience, his unwavering drive to help. It was as if the animal understood the weight of the moment, the lives hanging in the balance. Hours passed as the villagers worked together, pulling people from the wreckage and gathering them in the few safe spots that remained. The father found himself at the center of it all, his strength renewed by the courage and determination of those around him. Even the boy, despite his small size, helped where he could, offering water and comfort to those in need. By midday, the immediate danger had passed. The floodwaters had receded enough to allow for safe passage, and the remaining survivors had been accounted for. The village was in ruins, but its people had survived. They had lost so much, yet they stood together, united by their shared struggle and the hope that they could rebuild. The father sat down on a dry patch of ground, his body aching and his clothes soaked with mud and sweat. The boy curled up beside him, his head resting on the father's shoulder. The dog lay at their feet, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. "You did it," the father said softly, his eyes on the dog. "You saved us all." The dog lifted his head, his ears twitching at the sound of the father's voice. His eyes, tired but bright, seemed to hold a wisdom that defied explanation. The father reached out and gently stroked his fur, his touch filled with gratitude. The woman, who had been quietly tending to some of the injured, approached them. She knelt beside the dog, her hand resting lightly on his back. "He's always been like this," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "He has a way of knowing who needs him most." The father looked at her, his brow furrowing. "You said he was yours before. How did you lose him?" She sighed, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "It was years ago, during another storm. He disappeared, and I thought he'd been taken by the flood. But now I realize he must have been helping others, even then." She looked back at the dog, her eyes shimmering with tears. "He's not just mine. He belongs to everyone." The father nodded, understanding the truth in her words. This dog wasn't just a pet or a stray. He was a protector, a guardian who had given everything to ensure the safety of those around him. As the day wore on, the villagers began to organize themselves, gathering what little supplies they could salvage and planning how to move forward. The father joined them, offering his strength and support wherever it was needed. The boy stayed close by, his small presence a reminder of the innocence and resilience that had carried them through the darkest moments. By evening, a sense of quiet hope had settled over the group. They sat together around a small fire, sharing what food they had and recounting their experiences. Laughter mingled with tears as they found comfort in each other's company, their bonds strengthened by the ordeal they had faced. The father looked around at the faces of the survivors, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. They had lost so much, but they still had each other, and as long as they had that, they could rebuild. The dog lay near the fire, his eyes half closed as he rested. The father reached down and scratched behind his ears, smiling as the dog let out a contented sigh. "You're a hero," he said softly. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you." The dog opened one eye, his tail thumping weakly against the ground. It was as if he was saying, "You already have." In the days that followed, the villagers worked tirelessly to rebuild their homes and lives. The father became a leader among them, his strength and compassion inspiring others to push forward. The dog remained by his side, a constant reminder of the courage and selflessness that had saved them all. And though the scars of the flood would remain, the village grew stronger. The people learned to lean on one another, their bonds unbreakable. And every time they looked at the dog, they were reminded of the power of hope, resilience, and the unshakable spirit of a true hero. As the sun set one evening, casting a warm glow over the recovering village, the father stood on a hill overlooking the valley. The boy stood beside him, his hand clasped tightly in his. The dog sat at their feet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We'll be okay," the father said, his voice steady. "We'll rebuild, and we'll remember what really matters." The boy nodded, his face thoughtful. "Like helping each other," he said. The father smiled, his heart full. "Exactly." The dog let out a soft bark, as if in agreement. The father reached down and ruffled his fur, his touch filled with gratitude and love. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, the father, the boy, and the dog stood together, their hearts united by the trials they had faced and the unbreakable bond they had formed. The flood had taken much, but it had also given them something priceless, a reminder of the strength of the human spirit and the power of a single act of courage to change everything. And with that, they turned toward the village, ready to face whatever the future held.